Hi, my name is Leslie Anderson. I'm the Director of Collections, Exhibitions, and Programs at the National Nordic Museum. Thank you for joining us for this morning's virtual Meet the Author, The Border, a journey around Russia through North Korea, China, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Latvia, Estonia, Finland, Norway, and the Northeast Passage. This program features author Erika Fatland, and the program is moderated by Dr. Scott Radnitz. So it's my pleasure to introduce both featured speakers today. Erika Fatland has studied social anthropology at the University of Oslo and is the author of 2 previous books in Norwegian, The Village of Angels and The Year Without Summer. She speaks 8 languages and lives in Oslo with her husband. Dr. Scott Radnitz is the Herbert J. Ellison Associate Professor of Russian and Eurasian Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington here in Seattle. He does research on post-Soviet politics with an emphasis on Central Asia and the Caucasus, specializing in topics such as authoritarianism, identity, and informal politics. He is the author of Revealing Schemes, The Politics of Conspiracy in Russia and the Post-Soviet Region, and co-editor of the forthcoming Enemies Within, The Global Politics of Fifth Columns, both with Oxford University Press. Professor Radnitz is an associate editor of Communist and Post-Communist Studies and a member of the program on New Approaches to Research and Security in Eurasia. Welcome, Erika and Dr. Radnitz. I now turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I think we agreed that Erika would start off with a brief summary of her book, and then I'll give some brief comments and then start the Q&A.
Okay, so the book is, as you can see, it's not a thin book. It's a very thick. It's 600 pages, but I'll do my best. So I got the idea to write this book. I remember it very well. It was in 2014 in February, and I was then finishing my previous book, Sovietistan, and I don't have a job. So I need to have good ideas. And I was looking for good ideas, and I had many ideas, but none of them were particularly good. And then one night I dreamt I was walking on a big map, and I was walking from country to country. But north of the red line, there was always the same country, Russia. So when I woke up that morning, I had the plan for the next years of my life ready. I decided to do that journey in reality, to travel around the biggest country in the world, Russia, to find out, to research what does it mean to have the biggest country of the world as your neighbor. So Norway is one of Russia's neighbors, but there were 30 from North Korea through China, and well, Leslie just read the title, and all the way through Asia and across the Black Sea, and then through Ukraine, Belarus, and all the way to the Norwegian border. And the book starts with what was the last part of this very long journey, which was the journey through the Northeast Passage, because the border of Russia is 60,000 kilometers long. So it's 1.5 the size of the diameter of the Earth. Or what's it in English? The longitude of the Earth. Yes. 2/3 of that border is coastal border. So it was very important for me to also travel through the Arctic. And that is where the book starts, with the journey through the Arctic. And then if you ask me, I mean, I've spent 600 pages discussing what does it mean to have Russia as your neighbor. And the short answer is it's difficult.
Perfect. Okay, so I just want to start off by saying this is a really impressive book. It was interesting and captivating to read. It reads very quickly. The 558 pages, feel like a mere 100 pages of the kind of academic drudgery that people like me have to read. It's an interesting hybrid of genres. It's part travelogue, part history, and also a snapshot of a moment in time, because developments happen frequently in this part of the world. And so when you did this work in 2016, when you were there, it's freezing in time what was happening. but it's been 5 years since then, and a lot has also changed. So yeah, as you mentioned, you went through quite a few countries, 14 countries and 3 want-to-be countries, and probably just as many means of transportation to get around. And I have to say, I was very jealous reading this. I love this part of the world. It's fascinating, and I have often dreamed of being able to just take months. I'm not sure if I could have handled a year, but the time to just travel and have these experiences. And most of my traveling, I've been to some of these countries, but it's mostly been by plane, and landing in airports is not nearly as exciting and conducive to these, serendipitous experiences that you've had entering over land. You point out that Russia borders both Norway and North Korea, which are about as diametrically opposite politically as you can find, emphasizing the fact that Russia is a very large country with 11 time zones. There's a debate in academia about how borders matter. On one hand, states are very possessive of their sovereignty and find lots of ways to make the border as hard as possible in some parts of the world. On the other hand, there's the force of globalization, which involves diffusion across borders. And you can see in so many instances the way that borders matter and don't matter. They matter very much for migrants trying to get from Africa to Europe, but borders don't matter much for the spread of information, except in China. So you touch on a lot of interesting themes, right? You don't develop that, but that's not what this book is about. But the idea of borders, right, is always a fascinating topic, especially in this part of the world. I think the bigger question you raise, though, is how do neighbors matter? If you live in a small state, especially if your neighbor is Russia, it's hard not to be preoccupied with Russia. Russia looms large in the imagination and actual politics of places like Georgia, Azerbaijan, Latvia, increasingly Finland and Sweden. And this is just a fact of the reality we live in which there are power differentials between countries. But neighbors also matter because of the subtle political and cultural forces that they exert on their neighbors. It matters, for example, in the transition from 1991, whether you're in Central Asia and your neighbors are Afghanistan, Iran, and Russia, or if you're Czechoslovakia and your neighbors are Austria and Germany, it matters a whole lot, right? Because they exert various kinds of pulls and tugs. So it's not just that you border Russia, it's also who your neighbors are on the other side as well. And it's especially interesting, I think, to look at Russia from the periphery. Peripheries are give you interesting vantage points because so much of what we tend to read in the West is kind of imperial centric, a kind of colonial perspective on the world from the capital cities, from big cities where political and economic elites are located. They tend to produce a lot of the material that we read. Moscow or St. Petersburg. And even the Western scholars who study Russia usually go to those capitals and look out on the world from the apex, right, from the imperial core. But Russia looks very different if you're outside of Russia, but not just being in the periphery, it also depends on which periphery. Russia looks very different depending on whether you're in Tashkent or whether you're in Riga. So I cut my teeth as a scholar in Central Asia from the periphery, and Russia looks very different from there than it does if you start in Moscow and then work your way out to the periphery. And of course, a lot of people who start in the imperial capitals never really leave them, and so they don't get this perspective. So Erika offers this alternative view on Russia and a lot of major issues of the day. Okay, so that's my segue then into some questions I'm going to ask, and then I think we'll do this till about 11:40, and then I will take some questions from the Q&A and ask them. So to transition from the last comments I made, I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your novel approach. What do you think we can learn about Russia by being around it and not in it? What kinds of benefits does that perspective bring that you don't get by being in Russia and even in the periphery of Russia itself?
Okay, well, let me just start with you mentioned borders and what does border matter today and the importance of borders. And I have this obsession with borders. I'm very fascinated with borders. And we tend to forget that borders matter in Europe because of the European Union and the open borders now. You hardly notice when you cross a border anymore. That is not the case in the rest of the world. But many times, most of the times when we travel, we arrive by airplane, and then also you don't get this border crossing feeling. But when I was writing this book, The Border, I crossed so many borders, and it never stopped fascinating me, the change. And there were some extreme changes. For instance, crossing the border from North Korea to China. And the thing is, when you cross a border, you don't travel very far. It's a few hundred meters, maybe 1 kilometer. So the landscape, the nature surrounding you is the same, the weather is the same, and still you step out in a totally new reality. As coming from North Korea to China, ironic as it might seem, it felt like entering a country of freedom, because in North Korea you're always followed by guides and everything is so controlled. And then coming to the neon signs of China, entering the capitalist world, it seemed like I'm kind of coming home. And then going from China to Mongolia, going from one of the most populous country in the world to one of the least populated countries in the world. In Mongolia, there are more sheep than there are people. So again, this extreme contrast. And also, when I wrote Sovietistan, which is about the Central Asian countries, I made a vow never to go back to Kazakhstan. Not because I didn't really like Kazakhstan, but just because I found it a bit boring compared to the other Stan countries, which are so eccentric. You have the Turkmen dictatorships, you have the historical cities of Uzbekistan, you have the mountains of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and then Kazakhstan just seems plain and boring in comparison. But now, coming from North Korea, coming from Mongolia, coming from China, and I don't speak Chinese, and I certainly don't look Chinese, so then crossing the border to Kazakhstan, that somehow felt like coming home. And I was so happy to be in Kazakhstan, which also brings to point the subject of how subjective travel literature is, and how subjective we are as persons, and how we perceive places and persons very much depends on where we come from at that very moment. But to answer your question, what does Russia look like from its neighbors? So of course, it looks very different from North Korea than it looks from Norway. Being the neighbor of Russia has been historically very difficult, and as we know, it's still very difficult today. Among the 14 neighboring countries, Norway is the only country that has never been at war with Russia or been occupied by Russia. So that says something about what it's like being the neighbor of Russia. Now, also, I mentioned Kazakhstan. After entering Kazakhstan, I was able to communicate in Russian until I came to Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, because during all this time from Kazakhstan through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, I was traveling in the former Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was just the continuation of the Russian Empire. So, most of the neighbors has been part of Russia for longer or shorter times of history, which also means that they share in those countries will speak Russian. Many Russians live in those countries. So traveling outside of Russia is still kind of like traveling inside of Russia, or in former Russia at least.
Maybe to touch on one thing you just said about what it's like to write travel literature. You have a good quote on page 258. To what extent can one rely on one's impressions and memories? Not only are we subjective creatures, we are also capricious. Everything we experience is filtered by our form and mood at the time, our expectations, what we may have experienced, and what we learn for at the moment. And then you say, which prompts the small but rather unnerving question: is travel literature to be trusted, or any literature that is based on memory, for that matter? Can you answer your own question?
Well, can memory be trusted? That is a big question, and I think the answer really is no. Yeah, your memory cannot be trusted. The inspiration for that quote was Aktau, and so again, it's Kazakhstan that spurred these reflections. The first time I came to Aktau, then I came from Turkmenistan, and Turkmenistan it's not as isolated as North Korea, but still it's a very isolated dictatorship, and they have not taken the step into capitalism. So then coming from Turkmenistan to Kazakhstan, I suddenly saw Turkmenistan in another light. And again, I felt this freedom, being able to walk around freely, because you can't really in Turkmenistan. And the first place I came to after crossing the border, I got a hitchhike with a border guard, and he put me off by a shopping mall. And I just remember that shopping mall like some kind of Fata Morgana. It was fantastic being there, and the sushi and the pasta and the wine that was suddenly available. I just remember being so happy in that shopping mall, and there were ATMs, and it was just fantastic after Turkmenistan. So next time I was in Kazakhstan, I was really looking forward to going back to Aktau and to go to that shopping mall, because I had such fond memories from that shopping mall. And then when I came to the shopping mall, it was quite an unimpressive shopping mall. And when I came there, I even remember that I don't even like shopping malls. And I went to the sushi restaurant, and the sushi was really terrible. So again, it all depends on just where you come from. So of course, yes, travel literature, it is very subjective. And I think the way to make it trustworthy is to make it transparent. So the reader needs to be able to follow you and understand where you are at this very moment. And I think that's the best you can do in order to make it transparent.
So you're trained as an anthropologist. Can you talk a little bit about how your approach as an anthropologist shaped the way that you traveled and the way that you interacted with people? Are there certain methodologies or insights that gave you that makes this work different from other travelogues?
Yeah, I often get this question, and I still don't really know what the answer is, because I didn't become an anthropologist to become a writer. I mean, I wanted to be a writer from the very beginning, and then at the age of 18, I realized that I would not be able to live from being a writer, and I thought that, well, having an education will not do any harm. And then I chose anthropology because it seemed like the most interesting thing to study at university. And I think it's a really interesting subject. And I think definitely I have profited from studying anthropology because anthropology teaches you to look at your own culture with a critical eye in order to look at other cultures and to understand them without judging them. And it also teaches you something about how diverse the world is. And you do learn also, I mean, it's a very practical subject. When you write your master thesis, you need to do a long field work, you need to train to do interviews. So of course, yes, I definitely think I profited from studying social anthropology. And in a way, I think if I did not study anthropology, I would not have become a travel writer, because I wrote my master thesis about Russia, and which was again because I wanted to learn Russian, and I found that was the best way to do it. And I wrote my master thesis about the terrorist act, the hostage crisis in Beslan in the Caucasus. And because before that, what I really planned to do was to write novels, and I have still not written any novels. I wrote my master thesis about Beslan and how the families after the terrorist attack, how they were coping after having experienced the worst a parent can imagine, losing their child in a terrorist attack. And I was not very happy having to write a master thesis with all 24 years old. I felt that I could not really understand these mothers better than they could understand themselves. So after finishing the master thesis, I went back to Beslan. I did more research, and then I wrote a nonfiction book just with interviews and telling their stories. And that's really how I started to write nonfiction. And then I continued writing books from the post-Soviet world, which is endlessly fascinating world.
And then also, connecting to your personal and professional background, how do you think being from a small country, and especially not being from a well-known country in that part of the world, like the UK or the US, helped or hindered you as a Norwegian, introducing yourself as a Norwegian, even though you're often mistaken for Russian or maybe mistaken for a Yankee? Do you think it had some benefits then, being Norwegian, as opposed to carrying the burdens of being an American in a part of the world where America was the greatest enemy during the Cold War?
Probably. I mean, I've never tried to travel the world as an American, but I have met many Americans during my travels, and many of them, if they happen to have another passport, they tend to use that one when they're traveling. So yeah, I think being Norwegian is perceived as neutral. If people have heard about Norway, they tend to have some good associations with Norway. In Russia, I mean, we are a neighboring country. Most Russians look at Norway with fondness. They see us as a good neighbor. So yes, I probably do get some goodwill being from Norway. Very often also I meet people who have never heard about Norway, and then I just make it simpler and I say I'm European.
That has its benefits, I'm sure. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about maybe one of the subtexts that runs through the book, especially in the historical vignettes that you present. It's evident how much Russia has been able to integrate, or at least not alienate, diverse ethnicities. That is, you cite often this stat that the Russian government also often likes to cite. It has over 60 or 100, however many different ethnic groups and that many languages. But not only that, it's also evident how many non-Russians have occupied important positions in the government and in historically important episodes. You have Vitus Bering, the Duke of Richelieu makes some appearances, Sergei Vita, and for that matter, Sergei Shoigu, who's the Minister of Defense carrying out this brutal war. He's from Tuva. He's not an ethnic Russian. What do we learn about Russia in ways that might be sort of counterintuitive when we look at its history of having all these non-Russians circle through, successfully rising, up the echelons of the elite? What does that tell us about Russian history or Russia today?
So we do tend to think about Russia as a place where the Russians are living, and as you just said, that's not true. It's a multi-ethnic country, and I really realized that when I was in Beslan doing research for my master thesis. So Beslan, that is in North Ossetia, in the North Caucasus. And I did a terrible mistake on my first day there. I addressed the persons I met as Russians, and they were, because to me they looked Russians and they spoke in Russian, and they were deeply offended, explaining to me that they were certainly not Russians, they were Ossetians. And even if not so many people speak Ossetian anymore, still they have this deep sense of identity as Ossetian. So that was when I really realized how multicultural Russia is. And that's what Russia has done since the 15th century. It has started with Moscow and then just absorbing more and more people, and then mostly people in the east, which had very weak states. So, well, they didn't really have any states at all. So just absorbing these people. And that's how Russia gained the size it has today. Now, I mean, maybe this was different in the Soviet Union. because now I'm writing a book about the Portuguese Empire. I travel a lot in Africa, and there are some very deep connections between the former colonies and the Soviet Union. And most of the people I meet, they who were part of the resistance and movement, the freedom movement, they actually studied in the Soviet Union for many, many years. And I think, if you go back some decades, it was different, but the Russia I have learned to know is a deeply racist society. And I remember when I was studying Russian in St. Petersburg, and I told my teacher that, well, I'm learning Russian because I'm going to Beslan to talk to people there. And she said, well, Erika, you're going to the North Caucasus. You must not go to the North Caucasus. They are dangerous. They are terrorists. They are thieves. And this is also the same, as you would know, with migrants from Central Asia now going to Russia for work in the number of millions. They also experience a lot of racism. And I don't know exactly when gotten better during the Putin rule. He came to power by going to war against alleged terrorists in Chechnya.
So I'm glad you mentioned your current project about the Portuguese Empire, because as a political scientist, I like to compare different parts of the world because we can learn something from that too. I think it's significant that in the case of Russia and its neighbors, there are two relevant kinds of connection. One is the imperial history, that is at least the parts of the country, at least these countries that you went to, parts of countries that were once under the control of the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. But it's also the ongoing territorial connections by virtue of the fact that Russia's empire was land-based rather than an overseas empire like Europe. And so I wonder how much you can disentangle the influences that are felt by virtue of the fact that some countries were once ruled by Russia or the Soviet Union versus the fact that they are proximate to Russia today. In contrast to former Portuguese, French, or British colonies around the world, where they still bear the imprint of harsh colonial rule and institutionalized racism, but are physically distant from those powers today.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that is a big question. Well, we could start with Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is an interesting case, as you would agree. It has the longest border with Russia, and the border between Kazakhstan and Russia is the second longest border in the world, only beaten by the border between the US and Canada. But Kazakhstan is not a populous country. They have about, 19 million inhabitants, and about 20% of these inhabitants are ethnic Russians, and the Russians tend to live in the border regions. So no one in Kazakhstan will admit that they are afraid of their neighbor or what their neighbor might do. But what they have done in Kazakhstan is that they have silently, without making a fuss, they have made ethnic Kazakhs move to the border regions and then giving them economic incentives to do so. So, of course, it's a clear sign that they are worried. And maybe that was also one of the reasons why they chose to move the capital from Almaty in the south to Astana, which is now called Nur-Sultan in the north. And then if we talk about some other countries which are interesting and very different from Kazakhstan, then that's the Baltic countries, especially Estonia and Latvia. And Estonia and Latvia, they had a long period of freedom from Russia after the First World War, and then after the Second World War, they were again annexed by the Soviet Union. And kind of the whole downfall of the Soviet Union started in the Baltics. And then after 1991, when they gained independence, they have done everything to become European. And in 2004, they entered the European Union and NATO. And I'm sure that today they are very, very happy about this decision. But then they have a legacy from the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union that is much harder to deal with and that is their own population. So during the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, they would move people from Russia to the periphery. And today, still about 1/4 of the population of Estonia and Latvia, they are ethnic Russian. And many of these Russians, I mean, a lot of them, of course, are well integrated. The mayor of Riga used to be Russian. But many of them are not. Many of them don't speak Latvian or Estonian. Many of them don't even have citizenship, and they live in cities that are almost 100% dominated by ethnic Russians. So they're living in this kind of bubble inside of the European Union. And if you look at statistics, they have less education than the rest of the population. Their salaries are less, and so on. So this is a ticking bomb, and no one really knows what to do about it.
At the same time, though, research that I've seen, including surveys, have shown that those ethnic Russians overwhelmingly prefer to stay where they are and live in these countries that are in the EU rather than go to Russia or have their part of those countries absorbed by Russia. So.
Definitely. I mean, if they wanted to go back to Russia, they could. And in Central Asia, in the poorer countries in Central Asia, there are almost no Russians left. In Tajikistan, almost all of them have gone back to Russia. And same in Turkmenistan. But of course, life looks better in Estonia and Latvia, so they have chosen to stay. But still, many of them have not really chosen to become part of the society that they're living in. And I think this is one of the major problems in the neighboring countries today and in Russia today. It all has to do with 1991. So in Estonia and Latvia and those countries, for the Russians living there, for them it's still hard to no longer to be the ruling people. Now they are a minority in a small independent country. They are no longer the ruling people. And the same in Russia. I mean, what happened in 1991, it was not just the fall of the Soviet Union, it was the fall of the Russian Empire. The Russians, they have never really dealt with this. They have never really dealt with their past. They have never dealt with the brutalities and the crimes committed during the Soviet Union. They have never really dealt with their imperialism like other European countries have, and like Germany had to do after the Second World War. But in Russia, they kind of still see themselves as victims, and they have continued mentally, many of them, to live in a Cold War. And I think the result is what we're seeing today with the war in Ukraine.
I wonder if when traveling outside of national capitals, you also noticed some interesting differences in people's identities or how people felt about power differentials. Because on one hand, you have Russia and then states around it, but within countries, you also have power differentials, especially in these countries. Power, economic influence is all concentrated usually in one or two cities. And as you get further away from those places, you find that people often don't share the same worldview as people in those capitals, and sometimes they can be even resistant or rebellious against the kinds of ideas that come out of national capitals. Did you experience that at all in your travels in second and third cities and even more peripheral parts of these countries?
I could mention Ukraine, but then we'd have to go further back than my research for the book, because about 1/3 of the population in Ukraine, they are Russian speaking. Many of them are bilingual, but about 1/3 have Russian as a mother tongue. So when I was studying Russian in 2006, I went to Odessa in Ukraine to study Russian, mostly because it was much cheaper than Moscow. And when I came to Ukraine in 2006, it was in many ways a very divided country. And I remember my teacher, who was from Odessa, she would talk a lot about the Orange Revolution, which was then 2 years back. And she would, obviously influenced by Russian propaganda, talk about how the demonstrators were all financed by the CIA. And what I felt that Ukraine in 2006 was very much divided, and maybe it was even more divided by the Orange Revolution, which took part in Kiev, which was maybe more of a revolution for the Ukrainian speaking, or at least for the Western Ukrainians who wanted to associate more with Europe, whereas in Eastern Ukraine, many still felt closer to Russia. Now, of course, when I came back to Ukraine in 2016, and that was 2 years after the annexation of Crimea and 2 years after the war broke out in Eastern Ukraine. In the war we're seeing today, it started actually 8 years ago. Then I came back to a very, very different Ukraine. And because of what had happened, because of what Russia had done to them, it was a much more united Ukraine. So that's actually what Russia has achieved with their actions in Ukraine, is to unite a divided nation.
And while we're on the topic of Ukraine, I'm jumping to the very end of the book, and you have some final thoughts about borders. You say, 583, Russia's border, as it is described here, will no doubt soon be history. Perhaps it will first become longer, only then to become shorter, like the convulsions of a dying snake. Is that what we're seeing now in Ukraine, the convulsions of a dying snake?
Well, I hope so. I really hope so. And now the topic of borders, that is quite difficult topic if you talk with Russians. Some years ago, I did an interview with a Danish newspaper, and the journalist asked me, what do you think Russia will look like in the future? What do you think will happen to the Russian border? And I didn't really want to answer because it's very difficult to predict the future. But then he kept asking. And then I said, in 100 years from now, I think the Russian border will look different from today, which is not a very controversial thing to say, because the Russian border has been a very active border and it has changed a lot. And then I added, I think the border will be smaller. And this interview was somehow picked up by a Russian journalist, and it was translated to Russian, and it was published in all the big Russian online papers with more and more fantastic headlines. And I remember some of the last ones where the Norwegian writer Erika Fatland predicts the fall of Russia within 100 years. And then for some period, I had to close all my social media accounts because I was attacked by very angry Russians and probably a lot of Russian state trolls as well. So that says something about, the idea of the empire, the Russian Empire, and their long border is still very much alive in Russia, and their large border, their great territory, that's a very, very important part of Russian identity.
It's one of the hazards of the job, I guess, when you speak publicly on matters of essential identity issues like sovereignty and borders. Yes, that might cause a scandal. A Russian ideologue or provocateur was predicting how America was destined to break up into 6 different pieces, and Russia talks provocatively about taking back Alaska. And of course, those ideas are always, dismissed as ridiculous. But I think history should give us a sense of humility, because nobody expected the Soviet Union would collapse, as soon as it did, the way that it did, or ever for that matter. And borders that seem fixed and permanent have ways of changing. And history has ways of surprising us, especially where politics is volatile. And everything seems predictable and solid until it no longer does. I think we should all remember that. It's not just a question that relates to Russia, but to other parts of the world also. And then finally, before we go to the audience, do you have any travel advice for future budding anthropologists / travel writer, adventurer, backpackers? And any really surprising places you found along the way that other writers haven't noticed, haven't landed on yet, that you'd recommend to your audience?
Well, there are places that I mean, most of the places I went to doing research for this book, I wouldn't really recommend anyone to go there. I mean, I go to radioactive places, I go to war zones, I go to North Korea, and none of these are places I would recommend anyone to go to. But, and I'm sure you would agree, I have one favorite country, and that is Georgia, and I would recommend absolutely everyone to go to Georgia, which it's a small country, but it's a country that has everything. They have the Caucasus Mountains, the tallest mountains of Europe. They have beaches at the Black Sea. Now they make wonderful wine. So if you cannot go there, you could buy some Georgian wine or maybe visit a Georgian restaurant. They have definitely the best food in the post-Soviet world. And then it's the Georgians themselves who are, all of them are very hospitable and totally crazy people. They are like Italians on speed. So they will make sure to make your journey to Georgia unforgettable.
You shouldn't necessarily assume about the travel preferences of people because, as you know, not everybody prefers good food and sunshine. You came across other tour groups going through Chernobyl. I expect more and more people to now take icebreaker cruises because this is interesting and people want to have unique experiences like you did. So, so maybe some of the harsher experiences that you had also might be intriguing, might be attractive to some people. So there's only a few questions in the chat and Q&A. Please put them in the Q&A so we can have them in one place. So I'll start with one question here. That is, can you talk about the experience of having your book translated into English or other languages in which it may have appeared? How is the narrative different in translation than in the original Norwegian? I'm curious about the notion of language as a border and what happens when you cross it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I trust my English translator a lot because she's half Norwegian, so she speaks Norwegian and English fluently. But of course, it is interesting also to learn that I mean there are two different editions, not two different translations, but they do change the language a little bit from the UK edition to the US edition. They probably take out some commas and change some S to Zs. It is a privilege to be translated. Sovietistan is now translated to 26 languages. The last one was now China, and it's been long in the waiting. I think the translation has been ready for a couple of years, but then they had to wait to get through the censorship and to get the ISBN number. And finally, just a few weeks ago, they got this magic number and was able to publish. So that also says something about authoritarian states. Russia, in Russia, the border in Sovietistan got published without any problems whatsoever, not being censored, no questions asked. But to publish the book in China, even in Sovietistan, I don't think I mentioned China by a word, really. It's just there in the background. But just like Russia sees Central Asia as their backyard, so does China. And I didn't really think about that.
Here's another question. Erika, I'd be interested in learning how you think that the Norway Russia border has changed. I crossed it in 2001 by bus with a busload of Western diplomats invited by the government of Norway in cooperation with Russia in Andreva Bay, Murmansk. Even then, the border was really weird. I assume it's much different now.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I mean, as I mentioned, the Norway historically has a very, very good relationship with Russia, and probably the Norwegian-Russian border is one of the most peaceful borders in the world. There's never been a war between Russia and Norway, and I mean the reason for that is not that, of course, we are also very nice people, Norwegians, but the main reason is because of geography. Before Murmansk was founded in 1916, and then they built the railway to Murmansk. And before that, the fastest Norway and the Kola Peninsula, and that was with boat around Scandinavia. So it was just too much of a bother to invade Norway. And when you look at today, which the countries that are at risk, these are the countries that has formerly been part of the Russian Empire. Also, there has been a very good relationship in Kirkenes, which is the border town closest to Russia. They had this visa-free arrangement now. There's been a lot of culture, a lot of contact between Kirkenes and the closest towns on the Russian side after the fall of the Soviet Union. And of course, now after the war in Ukraine, this has totally stopped. Now there is no contact anymore. And I know that the people in Kirkenes, some of them have dedicated their life to this cultural cooperation with Russia, and they are now devastated, and they feel that a lifetime of work has just been wasted, and it's very difficult to see how this good cooperation can continue in the future or in the near future. As long as the Putin regime is in power, I think there will be no good relations between Russia and Norway.
Different topic here. Martha asked, did you have any issues traveling as a woman in these countries? I'm a single woman who travels alone much of the time. I have to say, one of the recurring themes of the book is how many questionable and disgusting men approached you at various times, and the question every time is whether you're married, right? That's just about in every country. Very typical.
Really? Is that the impression you have? Well, that's interesting, because
It's occur in just about every place you went, yeah.
No, because I really feel that I don't have many difficult encounters, and I mostly feel very safe. And I mostly feel that Asia, maybe particularly Central Asia, is a very safe place for women with little sexual harassment. Of course, some encounters there will be. In the end, nothing bad happens. Of course, when you are there in that situation, in that car with that man, of course, you don't know how that particular situation will end. So there were moments when I was afraid, and definitely the most dangerous moments were the moments when I was alone in a car with a man I did not know. But then I would say, generally, the most dangerous thing you do, whether you are a man or a woman, is getting into a car in these countries. They drive like crazy, and no one really passed any tests. The driving license is something you buy, right? So now I would say, generally, I think it's an advantage traveling as a woman. My newest book, which will be published in the US, I think next year, is from the Himalaya, and then I traveled in Pakistan. And Pakistan is it's a much more conservative country than the countries I traveled through writing The Border. And then I think definitely it was an advantage being a woman, because as a man, you couldn't really access the women. You would not be allowed to talk to women, but I could talk to women, and of course also men, who are always willing to talk. And then just another point is that when I did interviews with men, and maybe with important men, often they tend to underestimate me because I'm a woman, which is also an advantage, because then they will feel free to say much more to me than they might say to you, for instance.
Yeah. Okay, another country bordering Russia is another difficult neighbor, Japan. The dispute over who owns the islands between the Kamchatka Peninsula and Hokkaido are a big pain point. In Tokyo, anti-Russian demonstrators show up in front of the Russian embassy in Tokyo to express their displeasure. So you didn't consider Japan to be one of the countries that borders Russia, but you might find some of the same issues, grievances, and preoccupations that you do in some of the countries you visited.
Definitely. I could have included Japan, and I could have included the US, and I actually did visit Alaska before starting on my journey through the Northeast Passage. But then, the book is already more than 600 pages, and I somehow had to limit myself. But I'm planning sometimes in the future to write a book about Russia itself, and then definitely I will visit the Kuril Islands. And before the war in Ukraine, there was some optimism that there was there, but now it looks darker than ever.
Yeah, this is the problem, because Russia's so big and potentially dangerous, it's a problem when Russia is not on speaking terms with other countries. It hinders the ability for countries to solve collective problems like, say, world hunger or climate change, which we're seeing now. A reminder, right, of how Russia, even though it's barely in the top 10 economies in the world, right, still has the ability to disrupt collective action in profound ways. So now, let's see. You got a question about Lithuania or Ukraine?
Ukraine. Let's go for Ukraine.
All right. Well, question of the day. How is this all going to end? Will Russia give up at some point? Will Ukraine shrink or disappear? On the question of borders, for sure.
Okay, now I regret not taking the Lithuanian question. How will it end? It's difficult to predict. I mean, before the 24th of February, very few people, except the US intelligence, believed that there would be a full-scale war in Ukraine, and even the Ukrainian president didn't believe so until just a few weeks before the war broke out, which is understandable because it just didn't, I mean, attacking militarily the second biggest country in Europe just doesn't make sense. And then when the war was a fact, most people, most experts, most military experts believed that Kyiv would fall within days, which did not happen. So to predict how this will end, I would not dare predict it. But what we are seeing now is that the fighting is back in Donbass, in the eastern Ukraine, where there has been fighting for 8 years already. I think how this ends very much depends on us, on the weapons that Ukraine receives and how hard they can fight back the Russians. And I think it's not up to us to decide whether Ukraine should accept some kind of peace agreement with Russia to give territories to Russia. That's up to the Ukrainians to decide. And what we have seen since 2004, when Russia grabbed small parts of the Ukrainian territories, well, then 8 years later, they came back and they wanted the whole of Ukraine. The goal of the current Russian regime is definitely to destroy Ukraine some way or the other. And then the question is, of course, also how long will this regime be in power? How long can Putin sit there as a dictator? There has been coup attempts, like you just mentioned. No one saw the fall of the Soviet Union coming, or the way it happened, and so quickly. So no empire lasts forever. And then again, it's very easy, I think, to confuse hope with analysis. It's
again, history has taught us that we should have some humility when we talk about world events, and especially trying to predict the future. Of course, lots of people do anyway because they get paid for it, and usually don't suffer any professional consequences from it. Scholars, though, tend to be a little more circumspect about doing that because like we know how complicated the world is. And then there's a question here about your next book and what that's going to be about.
Yes, like I just said, I'm in the beginning, I'm now working on something completely different. I'm working on a book about the Portuguese Empire. So at the moment, I'm still traveling and doing research, and I'm visiting all the former Portuguese colonies and territories. Now I'm mostly traveling in Africa, and then in the winter I will continue in Asia and ending my journey in Brazil. And it's a very interesting topic. It's very big. I think this book will be even thicker probably, but it's very interesting because the Portuguese Empire is not, at least in Europe, I don't know in the US, but it's not as well known as maybe the British, Dutch Empire, the French Empire, but it was the first. It was the first empire. It was the first global empire, the first overseas empire. And it all started with the Portuguese. It was the Portuguese who first managed to navigate down the coast of Africa and then onwards to India and Indonesia. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to trade with Japan. So it all started, the global world that we're living in today, and of course also the transatlantic slave trade, it all started with the Portuguese. So, and then also the Portuguese Empire was the last empire to fall. Timor-Leste, East Timor, became independent, at least officially, as late as 2002. And then the African colonies were not independent until 1975. So still there are so many traces of the Portuguese Empire. And I still can talk with witnesses who will remember the wars and for freedom and remember the Portuguese colonial rule. So it's a very big topic and it's extremely interesting.
That's a good note to leave off on. So now people have something to look forward to until the next conversation.
And then, yeah, so, sorry, the book that will be the next one in the about Himalaya, where I traveled through the Himalayan countries.
Okay, thank you. Leslie.
Okay, thank you so much, Erika Fatland, for speaking about your book before your travels and research resume. Thank you so much, Dr. Scott Radnitz, for guiding us through this wonderful conversation. Next month's virtual Meet the Author will feature Bernd Brunner and focus on his book, Extreme North, Cultural History, on July 16th at 11 a.m. Pacific. The moderator is Dr. Andy Meyer of University of Washington's Department of Scandinavian Studies. We look forward to seeing you all online.